So our next speakers are Lindsay, Kaye, and Scott Small from Recorded Future. So we've often talked about using threat intelligence to prioritize detections, but that isn't necessarily a small ask. It's both hard to understand what intelligence is important and where to focus resulting detection efforts. Next speakers are going to be talking about a process for using attack to bridge this gap and getting ahead of boom. So please welcome to the stage, Lindsay and Scott. Big green button.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Lindsay, Kaye, and this is Scott Small, and thank you for coming to our talk on prioritizing detection implementation with intelligence and attack. Sweet. So I'm Director of Operational Outcomes for Insikt Group. So I run the technical arm of our threat intelligence team, where we do the large majority of malware analysis, network detections, YARA, Sigma, and Snort development for the team. So by trade, I'm a malware analyst, reverse engineer, and I was a software engineer for many years before doing this.
All right, and I'll kind of get us started. I'm Scott Small. I'm a threat intelligence consultant on Recorded Future's customer success team. Our team engages our clients, enterprises, and agencies worldwide every day on security applications of intelligence. And I'm happy to report that MITRE ATT&CK remains very alive and well in the cyber threat intel space. We're consistently being asked for more attack-mapped intelligence and seeing more interest in using intelligence to inform attack emulation and purple teaming. So without a doubt, as interest and focus on TTPs continues to grow, MITRE ATT&CK remains the best lens in my view for analyzing TTPs. However, there are nearly 600 techniques and sub-techniques in the enterprise matrix and countless more implementations. And we'll circle back to this later, but we recently took a survey of publicly available detection rule repositories, and we found nearly 10,000 of these rules aligned with MITRE ATT&CK. So the need for prioritization is clear, and thanks to the efforts of this community, I'm definitely seeing a shift in awareness that intelligence should inform that prioritization. What we'll add today is more detail about how this functions. We'll give some takeaways derived from our recent client engagements, and I'm really excited we have the opportunity to kind of debut a new open source tool here today intended to help speed up identifying and closing control gaps. This theme of gaps is going to run throughout our talk today, so I want to start with how intelligence allows us to bridge gaps and why I see intelligence teams really as critical within a security maturity journey. 3 key ways. Number 1, intelligence teams usually have a strong understanding of the external threat environment, yes, but also the unique attack surface or profile of the organizations they support. What technologies or assets or processes exist within their environment today and what transformations might be coming. Number 2, intelligence teams typically have knowledge of both the strategic and the tactical levels of the threat space. What adversaries exist, what motivations and targets are out there, and how are attacks actually carried out and defended against. And finally, by maintaining that awareness of both the external threat environment and the internal operating and control environments, intel teams really are perfectly situated to bridge between the offensive and defensive disciplines of security. An adversarial relationship often exists between these. However, when there are closer lines of communication and tighter feedback loops, we really have the opportunity to achieve the quickest and most measurable improvements in security. 2 tools supporting these themes are, of course, MITRE ATT&CK, whose structure really enables us to better bridge that strategic and tactical levels of the landscape, and truly our analytical brains. The adversary is constantly innovating, and so we too must be able to adapt and logically break down attack patterns so we can adjust our defenses accordingly. This is also a reminder that we should continue working to offload automatable security tasks and leave ourselves as much time as possible for the more valuable critical thinking and analysis work. So before I hand it to Lindsay, I want to cover key sources that we use and recommend for surfacing attack-mapped intelligence. 3 types of sources that you might already be using, open, closed, and technical, can all yield value for MITRE ATT&CK alignment if you know where to look. Closed sources will include your own telemetry and internal reporting, sure, but there also is opportunities for aligning to MITRE ATT&CK on sources like restricted access forums. So Lindsay is going to cover cases where we see actors sharing tools on the underground, but we also map some of our reporting when we see actors selling illicit network access on criminal forums, for example. This gives us really interesting insights into initial access techniques specifically. Most of you are familiar with the government and vendor reporting that exists and is increasingly being aligned to MITRE ATT&CK. But one of the less commonly used sources for open source TTP intelligence is actually social media. There exists many opportunities where security researchers are publishing content that contains either direct references to techniques or in some cases even T-code identifiers themselves. And you can search these platforms for that type of content. Finally, some of you may be utilizing technical sources that automatically map to MITRE ATT&CK, things like sandboxes and network security tools. A common struggle that I hear in this space is that these same execution or phishing-related techniques oftentimes consistently bubble up within these sources. So what I recommend, and we've had clients recently expressing a lot of interest in, is looking at the techniques where we see the most monthly or quarterly increases in how much they're being observed. This gives us a little bit more nuanced look at which techniques may be trending over time. The bottom line is that sourcing from each of these areas gives us the most comprehensive view of the threat landscape. Also, when we begin to look at observations from multiple of these sources, we oftentimes see overlaps in techniques, and we start to see some that have higher concentrations than others. This really gives us a good foundation to focus in and potentially get higher return on investment if we're looking at the highly concentrated techniques. And very finally, just to reiterate, certain of these sources inherently will be looking retroactively at threats that have already been observed in the wild, whereas other ones really kind of enable us to start strengthening controls in a more proactive manner. This is going to be a perfect segue to Lindsay's content, where she's going to cover her team's process for surfacing and creating detections around these truly emerging and novel threats.
Awesome, thank you, Scott. So one of the things that our clients talk a lot about being worried about is the threat of a ransomware attack and what it could do to their organization. So for simplicity's sake, I've divided the kind of 4 stages of a ransomware attack into these 4 stages. So generally ransomware attacks are not just initial phish, suddenly the ransomware. So generally it involves some sort of initial access. So how a threat actor first gets onto the target system. Then once they're on, they'll do probably a couple of different things, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So try and move to other systems laterally. They might look for other information they want, escalate their privileges to get higher access, persist their attacks. So once they're in, making sure they're able to stay in, and then finally looking for other data that they may be interested in. Next, the data exfiltration aspect. So not every ransomware attack will involve data exfiltration, but for threat actors who are looking to further extort their victims and provide more incentive to pay the ransom, this might be a key component. And then finally, the dropping of the ransomware. So a couple examples of different techniques that you might see at each of these stages, and not every ransomware attack will involve all of these stages. Phishing remains eternally popular among many types of threat actors, both state-sponsored and ransomware. Generally, the lures are pretty timely, but we're not going to get into that because I think everybody's familiar. Exploits also remain pretty popular, so we're not really going to get into those as well. But one thing I want to talk a little bit about is the use of stolen credentials. So there are a couple different ways threat actors will do this. So first, they can drop some sort of credential stealer. So things like Redline, Raccoon Stealer, Thicker Stealer, and Azure might be used to gather victim credentials and exfiltrate them. But for threat actors who maybe don't want to do that themselves, they can actually purchase the exfiltrated logs from these systems on the dark web. Very similarly, there are, if you're already on the system, you can look in bash history for somebody who accidentally typed their password into it, private key files laying around, system administrator notes, or an internal application that was developed that was never supposed to see kind of any external use, but has baked in credentials for accessing different accounts on the system. So additionally, we see people called initial access brokers, who are threat actors that pretty much specialize in selling and obtaining initial access. So a couple different things here. I'm not going to get into all details here, but things to like VPN appliances, so things like Citrix, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and domain access up to and including administrator. There's a whole wide variety of different accesses that they will sell, and generally advertising it as selling access of this type to an organization approximately this size, this value. So never like, I have access to this specific place. So that's kind of what you're looking at here. Next, moving into that second stage. So Cobalt Strike deserves a special mention here, eternally popular among state-sponsored and ransomware threat actors, mostly because it's so full-featured. So pushing and pulling of data, running applications, dropping additional tools, and aggressor scripts would further help threat actors automate a lot of these techniques, make it even easier for somebody to want to use. Then you might see something like Active Directory enumeration with tools like AD-Find, Sharphound/Bloodhound, further credential harvesting. So once you're already on, gaining SSH access or RDP or VNC to other systems on the network can also be pretty helpful. Living off the LAN techniques, so those are those benign Windows binaries that are used for malicious purposes. So something like certificate utility to do second stage tool downloads, CSC and MS Build to compile code on disk and run it. Just those are kind of a couple of examples there. And then finally, something like Kerber roasting with a tool like Rubius. For data exfiltration, so something that ransomware threat actors will sometimes use are these benign tools. So I'm sure you're familiar with 7-zip and WinSCP for their more benign purposes. So these are just a couple examples there. And then only then do we get to the actual dropping of that ransomware. So when we talk about different threat actors like Revil, Black Matter, and Alpha, generally this is what the specific ransomware kind of comes in here. But as you can see, there's so many other things that have happened before and so many other opportunities to have caught them. So generally what we want to do is we try to focus our signature development as left of boom as humanly possible. And we found a lot of opportunity for developing detections here rather than once the ransomware has already dropped. So our tools and TTPs team sources their information from a wide variety of sources that Scott alluded to before. So we have open source data, closed source data, and technical sources. And part of the premise is, let's say, threat actors shared a new C2 framework, they're discussing a new credential stealer that they are advertising, proof of concept for an exploit. Generally, if we have access to it on the internet, so does a threat actor, and they will learn from it. So you can think of things like incident response reports, seeing how defenders are detecting them. Hey, here's a cool new C2 framework. I want to use this too. And it just lowers the bar so much and makes it a little bit harder to specifically attribute it. And it's kind of like download it, use it, and they see it too. So our tools and TTPs team will look through this variety of sources for things that we consider leads. So these are high potential tools that look very credible. So a credible GitHub or a credible kind of threat actor talking about selling tools or some kind of technique that they're using. And then what we do is we'll put together a TTP note. So again, these really function as leads. Maybe it's not really used in the wild as yet, but it's something that we want to inform our customers about. They might want to be concerned. For tools that we actually see used in the wild, maybe people are publishing copies of it, different things like that, or we really feel it's a high impact piece of software, what we'll do is we'll write an Insikt validated TTP. So these, in addition to kind of the context behind it, will produce a signature. So YARA, Sigma, or Snort, depending, maybe some combination of the three, that allows customers not only to get the context and know what it is, but then they can also detect it in their own environment. And what we make sure to do is we align these all to attack. So each of these types of notes has the attack techniques that it is relevant for, mostly because we are an intensely technical team. And we know that most customers aren't familiar with all the different nuances between this type of stealer or that exploit. And we really want to provide them that lingua franca between what it is that this thing does and help them understand it, whether or not it would be something they want to incorporate into their defensive strategy. Cool. So an interesting case study that I wanted to highlight is that of Gesture Stealer. So Gesture Stealer, for all intents and purposes, is an information stealer. So taking information from the victim's browser, stealing passwords, different things like that, pretty run-of-the-mill. But what we saw in August 2021 is a threat actor released this Gesture Stealer on the dark web. And what we did was we produced a TTP note. Hey, customers, be aware of this. Something interesting. Nothing really indicated it was in use as yet. Then, a couple months later, in January 2022, we saw another user on social media sharing a sample of the malware on Malware Bazaar. So this started to suggest that this was something that wasn't just interesting, maybe it was being used or could be used, or there was something a little bit more to it. So what we wanted to do is publish this Insikt validated TTP along with a Sigma rule to help our clients detect it now that it was more of a serious threat. So here is part of the Sigma rule that we made for gesture stealer. So as you can see, not only are we providing the context, so explaining to clients what it is, we are also providing this rule that is also mapped to MITRE ATT&CK. So they have as much context about whether or not gesture stealer could be a potential problem for them in their environment. And if they want to incorporate this rule into their defensive strategy, they totally can. And what was actually kind of really validating and really awesome is that about a month later, another vendor who sees a wide swath of malware samples, so not just kind of the ones that we're starting to see, actually identified gesture stealer as a high priority threat. So the fact that we were able to kind of get on it as early as August and be able to provide that detection early to our clients really did start to suggest that our process was working. I'm going to hand it back over to Scott.
Cool. All right, so in case there was any doubt that these intelligence-driven detection approaches can scale, I want to illustrate some examples and see kind of how this plays out at a wider scale for us. So what you're seeing right now is a heat map of the top techniques in the day-to-day reporting from Lindsay's team over the past year. So these emerging notable threats that we're tracking on a variety of sources and writing multiple of these reports per day, this is kind of what the top concentrations look like. We can then compare this to the top techniques in the mappings to the Sigma detections that her team has also produced over the same time frame. And when we directly line these up, we actually see quite a lot of overlap in the top techniques observed across these sources. So what this emphasizes is the day-to-day notable threats that we're analyzing. The top ones, top 15 are shown on the left here, really are reflected in our detection development program at scale. So here we're seeing the lining up of these. We all have limited resources to commit, in our case, to developing detection rules, and probably in your case, to deploying new rules, fine-tuning them, adding new data sources, and maybe tweaking those sources. So it's absolutely worth being thoughtful about what is driving the allocation of those resources, and we clearly believe that threat analysis should play a key role in this thought process. So I also want to, keeping with the same heat map here, I want to underscore this point about the value brought by strengthening controls in line with top technique concentrations. Again, it's about giving you the highest ROI for control validation resources. So across a year's worth of reporting, we saw over 300 discrete techniques and sub-techniques reported at least one time, again, in Lindsay's team's reporting. What I find interesting is when we zoom in on the top techniques. So let's use, for example, the top 15 that I highlighted in this previous slide. When we look at those, we actually see that a wide variety of adversaries are all associated with that relatively short list of techniques. So certainly over the past year or two, we've reported a ton about ransomware, and we do definitely see some similarities in the techniques used by these ransomware groups, especially when we look at certain areas like defense evasion. However, when we expand out a little bit broader, we actually see across the board a wide range of different tools associated with just this short list of techniques. So we see remote access and banking Trojans, offensive security tools, stealers, botnets, really a whole host of different tools, all utilizing this same short list of 15 techniques. If we go even a little bit further, we've actually basically seen the entire litany of major threat actor categories associated also with this relatively short list of techniques. So we've got advanced cyber criminal groups, and that does include ransomware groups as well. We see Russia, China, Iran, EPT groups associated with this list of techniques, even some hacktivist organizations. So all of this, I think, emphasizes that it's worth remembering that if you allocate resources to defending against even some of the techniques on kind of a top priority list like this, you are in reality likely closing gaps that could be exploited by a wide range of adversaries. Right, so many of the insights and recommendations we covered today derive from support engagements and conversations that we've had with our clients out in the field. Some of the most valuable discussions that we've had have come from support for threat or risk profiling exercises with our clients. I'm highlighting now some of the main high-level considerations that we recommend taking into account when building a risk profile and deciding the best approach forward for validating controls in line with that profile. What I think is important to emphasize here is that it's not at all just about external threats. Key considerations come down to entirely internal factors. And when we engage with cyber threat intel teams, especially, oftentimes some of these internal pieces are some of the most challenging for us to kind of get a complete handle on. So for example, do we really have a complete and up-to-date inventory of all of our internal assets? Maybe we haven't had a chance yet to line up our internal controls with the threats that we specifically are facing. Maybe we don't even have great visibility into our own detection capabilities as a result of not having great lines of communication with the SOC, or maybe we're using something like a managed service who doesn't really give us that direct visibility into what kind of detections we actually do have in place running within our organization. These are all very real internal focus considerations. So clearly we talk a ton about threat intelligence, but in order to help give our clients some time back to focus on those most valuable tasks, the critical thinking and analysis, we've put a ton of effort into supporting them around some of those internal factors of risk, especially around the internal controls environment. And that leads me into the last portion of our presentation. I'm really excited we have this opportunity to share some of these resources with the community today. So with just a few minutes remaining, I will mostly start to point you towards where we're hosting this, controlcompass.github.io. This is all open sourced, the data and the site code for you to download, pick apart, tailor it for your own needs, and would love to keep this conversation absolutely going after our talk here. But essentially what we've done is we aggregated a pretty huge collection of publicly available detection repositories. So in total, we've got over 9,000 of these detection rules, as well as over 2,100 offensive security or red team tests to complete that control validation feedback loop. And ultimately, we've made it all easy to surface all of these resources, since everything we included came with a mapping to an attack technique or sub-technique. So we followed our instructions and just included some screenshots. This is live now. You can go check out the site, but just to kind of walk you through some of the features of the tool, you can start really simple. If you already know a TTP of interest, and surface all of the various attack mapped resources that exist for it, at least the public ones that we included, across 15 detection repositories and 6 red team test repos. You can then also look up all detections and tests and their mappings for your portions of your security tech stack and the third-party detections or test sets that you might be using. And finally, and this is, again, derived directly from a lot of the client engagements that we've had over the past couple of years, you can then overlay some threat intel in MITRE ATT&CK Navigator layer format on top of those control mappings, with the end goal being to instantly identify where there might be gaps between your own threat profile and the controls that you currently have in place. So then you can go about more quickly closing those gaps, either by strengthening existing controls, or if you don't have detections or controls in place around certain techniques, you can use the tool to hopefully surface some additional ones that you could start to implement. And just to highlight kind of with the tool, hopefully you'll go check it out, but this does include just the mappings. We're not trying to kind of consolidate all of these rules in a single location. It's mostly pointing you towards resources. And so there is a fourth tab on here that will give you some guidance around how to navigate. As I'm sure most are familiar with, there's a wide variety in structure and formatting across these repositories. And so it gives you a little bit of detail about how to most quickly kind of navigate through those. So tons more to cover, hopefully in some follow-on conversations. But yeah, I think that brings us to a close. We tried to leave a little bit of time live for some questions. So thank you all for having us and for the time.
That was amazing. And who doesn't love a conference code drop? I mean, More tools, we all
Exactly.
Like you said, we're coming up on break, but we do have a couple minutes for questions. It's like building Intel teams and managing those. Like what advice would you give in terms of injecting, that kind of culture? You mentioned like, how every type of the process of the organization can kind of sit around Intel. How do you kind of push that to organizations so that, leadership and champions really adopt that and are willing to kind of put you on their shoulder?
I can start with that one. Yeah. So a couple things to keep in mind. I think one of the biggest things that we encounter is really trying not to like necessarily force it on organizations, because it really is, they're going to have to be in a people, process, and technology correct place to really put some of this into use. Sometimes you can, go out and purchase a bunch of these tools, and it honestly just creates additional alert fatigue. So that's not really like that helpful, but it's something to keep in mind that you don't want to force it. If the timing is not right, take into account some of those considerations. Beyond that, obviously, we're all biased in being here, but I do truly try to point folks towards MITRE ATT&CK to kind of get started with that process. Even if they're not thinking about it explicitly in an intelligence focus, it gives that blend of both the adversary perspective and the defensive perspective, and it really just puts them in a good foundation. And so just using a lot of the freely available resources from MITRE and a number of other sources as well, I think it's really a great starting point. I know it can be challenging to kind of start dipping your toes into it initially, but hopefully conferences like this, everything else is demonstrating the value.
Sorry, go ahead.
And something I also want to add is, like, as a threat intelligence team, making sure that the decisions you make are data-driven. So like I talked a little bit about, when we're looking for what it is that we want to write detections on, it's never just like, I feel like, no, it's like, okay, well, what are the different things that are coming out? And, what are the actual threats that we face? It's like everybody kind of wants to go after those new 0 days, but are those really the most popular sort of exploits that people are using? Things like that.
That makes a lot of sense. And like I said, I do want to get the audience here. I know might have been neglecting you with my own scope questions, so definitely want to give you an opportunity to weigh in. Right here.
Great presentation. You made one example showing public release of a TTP, and then months later, actually observe malicious use. But on average, what is that time frame from tool put on GitHub to that guy using it?
Well, that's an amazing question. Just to repeat for the live audience, the question is effectively, you mentioned the various types of Intel sources used. When you see a tool drop, and a new GitHub project or some type of new TTP, what's typically the time frame between observation of its existence versus actually seeing it operationalized?
Ooh, that's hard to say. So I think it kind of differs, and I don't want to be wrong. So I might take a rain check on that one and get back to you. Another one that we had seen a while ago was actually replace. That was a new kind of file encryption technique that we saw in ransomware. I think that was a couple months later. We actually saw a threat actor writing Thanos ransomware using it. So that was a couple months, just to give you kind of an example, but it could be longer, it could be shorter.
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time, but I can point you to some specific examples if you just want to like search for them. Empire has seen very quick adoption. Octopus, I think C2 is one of the classic cases where we saw, it was a time span of months. We've definitely seen faster than that. It really is kind of across the board, but it's anywhere between maybe literally hours to days to months. Very fast, basically, is the takeaway.
So I guess we have time for maybe one more question from the audience. I saw a couple hands go up. If not, again, I'll go back to my selfish questions because I love your presentation. I could probably put together a list. So really looking forward to you being on the couch with Kat as well. But you mentioned the different types of data sources or Intel feeds, open source, closed source, all the different types. As an Intel team, how do you track that? You mentioned how you assess it and kind of see value, but kind of keeping tabs of those so that all your analysts are kind of on the same page. What advice would you give in that domain?
Oh, that's a big one. Trying to maintain some sort of blend. I can't honestly think, maybe this is a useful takeaway, but of anyone who necessarily has like a structured balance and they're saying we need to get X percentage of our collection from these sources, it's mostly making sure that there is at least some collection from the various angles, because truly, like Lindsay emphasized with that one example, there are components flowing in from open, closed, technical that can all feed into a single threat.
Yeah, I know that's a tough one. In the spirit of common languages, I wish it was an easy answer, but yeah, I think that's a really great insight. It's just like you said, work with what you have and just yeah. So with that, we are at our final break of the day. Thank you both for your presentation, and we.